The bus rumbled down the winding mountain road, the golden hues of sunset painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The holiday trip was supposed to be a break, an escape from routine, from expectations. But as I stared out the window, my fingers gripping the cold metal of my seat's armrest, I could feel something shifting in the air. Then it happened. A sudden jolt. A sharp gasp from someone in the front. The driver cursed under his breath, jerking the wheel as the bus skidded slightly on the damp road. "Everyone, hold on." A chorus of startled voices filled the space. My heart pounded as I gripped the seat tighter. But before I could process what was happening, I felt a firm hand on my shoulder. It was him, Mr. Alex. His voice was steady, but his eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, held something I had never seen before. A flicker of concern, maybe even something deeper. "We're okay," he said, his voice low, "just for me. Just breathe." And for some reason, in that moment, his words carried more weight than they should have. Something was about to change. I could feel it. I was never the kind of person who stood out. In a room full of people, I was the one blending into the background, content with being unnoticed. My name is Daniel, and for as long as I can remember, I've been good at hiding my thoughts, my emotions, and most of all, a part of myself that I wasn't sure the world was ready to accept. This holiday trip was supposed to be just another school excursion, a week in the mountains with my classmates before the semester ended. For most people, it was an exciting break, bonfires, hiking, late-night talks in the cabin. But for me, it was another opportunity to keep my walls up. Then there was him, Mr. Alex. He was the kind of teacher everyone liked. Young, passionate, the type of guy who made history lessons sound like adventure stories. He had this effortless confidence, a way of making everyone feel seen. It wasn't just his good looks, the sharp jawline, the messy dark hair, the easy smile. It was the way he carried himself, like he belonged, like he had nothing to hide. I envied that, and maybe deep down I admired it too much. "Daniel, you good?" The voice snapped me back to reality. My best friend, Jason, nudged me from the seat beside mine, his eyebrows raised. "Yeah, fine," I mumbled, adjusting my hoodie. Jason was the only person who really knew me. Well, at least the parts one had allowed him to see. He had this natural confidence, always surrounded by people, always cracking jokes. Sometimes I wished I could be more like him. Other times I was glad I wasn't. Outside, the scenery shifted from city lights to endless trees. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks disappearing into mist. The excitement in the bus was contagious, people laughing, chatting, passing around snacks. But beneath it, I felt something else brewing, a restlessness inside me. It wasn't just about the trip, it was about him. Maybe it was the way Mr. Alex always seemed to notice when I was lost in thought. Maybe it was how his encouragement in class felt personal, like he actually believed in me. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, sometimes his expression unreadable. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. This trip was going to change everything. I just didn't know how yet. The night air in the mountains was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The first day of the trip had gone by in a blur, group activities, a long hike, and dinner in the lodge's massive wooden hall. Now, most of the students were gathered around the bonfire, laughing and sharing stories, the flames flickering against their faces. I sat at the edge of the group, watching, but not really part of it. Jason was in the center, animatedly telling some exaggerated story that had everyone's attention. It was easy for him, effortless. I pulled my hoodie tighter around me, staring into the fire, letting the warmth soak into my skin. That's when I heard his voice. "You always sit on the edges, don't you?" I looked up. Mr. Alex stood a few feet away, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw. His expression was unreadable, curious, maybe. "I like the edges," I said, forcing a small smile. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the fire as if studying it. "You remind me of myself at your age," he finally said. That caught me off guard. "Mr. Alex?" The confident, charismatic teacher who could hold an entire class's attention? There was no way. I didn't know what to say, so I just let the silence stretch between us. It wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. Then he shifted his stance slightly, lowering his voice. Take a walk with me? My heart skipped. It wasn't unusual for teachers to check in on students during trips, but something about his tone, about the way he asked, made my pulse quicken. Sure, I said, pushing myself up. We walked away from the fire, down a narrow dirt path that led toward the cabins. The voices behind us faded, replaced by the distant sound of crickets and the rustling of trees. The night stretched wide above us, stars scattered like tiny sparks in the sky. For a while, neither of us spoke, but there was a tension in the air, something unspoken lingering between us. I see how you hold back, Daniel, he finally said, his voice quieter now, like you're afraid to take up space. I swallowed hard, not expecting him to see me that clearly. Maybe, I admitted. He glanced at me, his expression softer than I'd ever seen. You don't have to. I didn't know what he meant, or maybe I did. But before I could ask, before I could say anything, he stopped walking and turned to face me fully. And in that moment, under the endless sky, something shifted. Something I wasn't ready for. We stood there, under the vast night sky, a silence stretching between us. The air was cold, but my skin was burning. Mr. Alex's words lingered in my mind. You don't have to hold back. What did he mean? Was he just being kind, or was there something deeper behind those words? I wanted to ask, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded, stuffing my hands into my hoodie pocket. Thanks, I mumbled. Mr. Alex studied me for a moment, then gave a small smile. Let's head back, before they start telling ghost stories about us disappearing. I forced a chuckle, but as we walked back to the bonfire, my mind was spinning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying in my bunk, surrounded by the soft breathing of my cabin mates, I replayed everything in my head, his voice, his words, the way his eyes had held mine. It wasn't normal, was it? A teacher taking that much interest in a student? Or was I just reading too much into it? The next morning, I tried to shake the thoughts away. I focused on blending into the background, on staying invisible. But it was impossible when I kept catching Mr. Alex's eyes during breakfast, during roll call, during every damn moment that my brain refused to let me ignore. And then it happened again. The challenge hike. It was supposed to be the toughest part of the trip, a grueling 3-hour hike up to a scenic overlook. Some students were excited, others groaned about the effort. Me? I was somewhere in between. Jason was all energy, hyping everyone up. Come on, Danny, this is the kind of thing that makes people legends. We're going to be out there, battling nature, surviving. Jason, it's a marked trail with a guide, I said flatly. Still, adventure, dude. I rolled my eyes but smiled. Jason had a way of making things seem bigger than they were. The hike started fine. The trail was steep, the sun was hot, but I kept my head down and pushed forward. Then, about halfway up, the path narrowed. Rocks jutted out, uneven and slippery from a morning dew. I didn't realize I was struggling until I felt my breath quicken. Panic. I stopped walking, staring at the uneven ground ahead. My chest tightened, and suddenly the voices around me faded. Not here. Not now. I tried to force air into my lungs, but the more I thought about it, the worse it got. And then, a hand on my shoulder. I turned, my breath still shallow, and met Mr. Alex's steady gaze. You're okay, he said softly. I shook my head. I just need a second. He nodded, crouching down beside me. Breathe with me. I didn't want him to see me like this, weak, vulnerable, but I had no choice. I followed his slow, deep breaths. In, out. In, out. Slowly, the world stopped spinning. Jason appeared next to me, frowning. Dude, you good? I swallowed, nodding. Yeah, just a little dizzy. Mr. Alex's eyes flicked to mine for a second before he spoke. Let's take a break. I hated that he had seen me like that. Hated that I needed his help. But a small, secret part of me felt something else, something terrifying. Relief. That evening after the hike, I sat alone near the fire pit, staring into the flames. Most of the group had gone back to their cabins, exhausted. I heard footsteps, and I knew before looking who it was. "You did well today," Mr. Alex said, sitting on a log beside me. I scoffed. "Yeah, if freezing up counts as well." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You pushed through. That's what matters." I hesitated. "You always do this?" His brow furrowed. "Do what?" "Notice things about people." A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. I tried to. A beat of silence. The fire crackled between us. Then I asked the question that had been clawing at my mind since the night before. "You said I remind you of yourself," I said carefully. "Back when you were my age." Something shifted in his expression. His fingers flexed against his knee, as if debating how much to say. "I was quiet," he admitted. "Didn't think my voice mattered much. Took me a long time to realize that wasn't true." His words hit deeper than I expected. Before I could stop myself, I said, "How did you figure it out?" He exhaled slowly, staring into the fire. "Someone made me feel like I was worth listening to." The way he said it, soft, almost nostalgic, made something twist inside me. For a second, it felt like we weren't teacher and student, just two people sharing a moment. I should have looked away, should have changed the subject, but I didn't. Instead, I held his gaze, my heart pounding in my ears. And in that moment, I knew this trip was going to change me forever. The final night of the trip arrived faster than I expected. The last group activity, a late-night gathering under the stars, was wrapping up, and students were making their way back to the cabins. Laughter echoed in the distance, but I stayed behind, sitting on a flat rock, overlooking the dark forest below. The sky was endless, stars scattered like tiny fireflies. I wasn't sure how long I'd been alone when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, hesitant. "I figured you'd be here," Mr. Alex's voice broke through the quiet. I didn't turn around. "It's peaceful." He walked over and sat down beside me. Close, but not too close. Just enough that I could feel his presence, warm despite the chill, in the air. "Something on your mind?" he asked. "Everything." I swallowed hard, gripping my hands together. This trip felt different. He nodded. "Yeah. I don't know," I muttered. "I feel like something changed in me, and I don't know what to do with it." I finally turned to face him, and when I did, I saw something in his expression that made my stomach flip. He knew exactly what I meant. The weight of unspoken words settled between us. Mr. Alex inhaled sharply, then looked away, like he was choosing his next words carefully. "Daniel," he said softly, "I know that feeling, and it's terrifying, isn't it?" My breath hitched. I didn't expect him to say that. To understand. "It's not just terrifying," I admitted. I stopped myself. My heart was pounding. Mr. Alex turned toward me again, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You don't have to say anything before you're ready." But I wanted to say something. I wanted to ask why I felt this way around him, why his words meant more than they should, why I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me. Instead, I said, "What if I don't know who I am?" His gaze softened. "Then, you take your time figuring it out, and you don't do it alone." I exhaled, my chest tight. A gust of wind passed through the trees, rustling the leaves like a whisper. The world felt suspended, like it was waiting for me to make a choice. And, for the first time, I didn't want to run from it. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the night wrapping around us like a heavy, invisible blanket. The fire pit from the camp was still burning in the distance, its flickering glow barely reaching where we sat on the rock ledge. I could hear the faint echoes of my classmates' laughter as they settled in for the night. It was comforting and distant, like a world I wasn't sure I fully belonged to anymore. Mr. Alex exhaled, slow and steady, the way he always did when he was thinking. He finally said, "When I was younger, I spent so much time trying to be what other people expected me to be, trying to push things down, to pretend certain feelings weren't there." I turned to him, but he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the stars above, lost in something bigger than either of us. "What changed?" I asked. He smiled, faintly shaking his head. "One day, I realized that ignoring who I was didn't make those feelings disappear. It just made me feel lost. My throat tightened. Lost. That was exactly how I felt. I don't know what this means for me, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if it means anything. He turned to me then, his expression open and understanding. And that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. No one does. A part of me wanted to believe that. Another part, the scared part, was still afraid of what it meant if I did. We sat there for a while longer, the weight of the moment settling between us in quiet acceptance. I wasn't sure how long it had been before Mr. Alex finally stood, brushing off his jeans. We should head back before someone comes looking for us. I hesitated before following him, reluctant to let the moment slip away. As we walked back, side by side, the air between us felt different. Lighter, maybe, or just realer than it ever had before. The next morning, the camp was alive with the usual chaos of departure, people stuffing bags into buses, teachers checking off names, friends taking last-minute selfies. Jason was already making plans for a reunion, hyping everyone up about how this trip changed all of us, man. I smiled, shaking my head, and then I saw him. Mr. Alex stood near the faculty van, clipboard in hand, talking with another teacher. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the crowd. He gave me a small, knowing nod. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic farewell, just a quiet acknowledgement. And somehow that was enough. The ride home was different. I leaned my head against the bus window, watching the trees blur past, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself breathe. Maybe I didn't have all the answers. Maybe I didn't even know the right questions. But I wasn't alone in figuring it out. And for now, that was enough. Months passed and life carried on. The holiday trip became a memory, something people looked back on with nostalgia. My friends joked about the dumb things we did, the pranks, the late-night talks, but for me, that trip meant something more. It was the moment I stopped running from myself. I never spoke about that night on the rock with Mr. Alex. Not to my friends, not even to him. But I didn't need to. Some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. What changed wasn't sudden or dramatic, it was subtle. I started asking myself the questions I was too afraid to face before. I let myself sit with the uncertainty, with the possibilities, without trying to force an answer. And strangely, that made all the difference. One afternoon, I ran into Mr. Alex at a coffee shop near school. He was grading papers, a familiar, easy smile on his face. When he saw me, he simply nodded. "How's life treating you?" he asked. I thought about that for a moment, then smiled. "I'm figuring it out." His eyes held something warm, something knowing. Good. And for the first time, I really believed it.